Dirt. It's everywhere. Who even bothers to think about it? If you're a gardener, you think about it.
Betsy, look at these beans. We must plant some of them. Oh, Bill, we must plant corn, too.
If you're a farmer, you think about it even more. And if you are a farmer on the west side of California's Central Valley, you think about it a lot. Sometimes, what we thought was in our past is actually still very much with us, impacting the choices and decisions that we face today. These are pictures of horribly deformed birds. They were found by U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologist Harry Ohlendorf at the Kesterson National Wildlife Refuge in the western side of the Central Valley in 1983.
It was a surprise that we were seeing such obvious evidence of a problem. S9 has no eyes, and actually it's the brain that's sticking out where the eyes should be. The lower beak is curled. There's only one toe on each foot, and the legs are misshapen. If you compare that to S13, which is the normal, you can see the big differences between the size and shape of the legs, the shape of the body, the shape of the beak.
To understand the story of Kesterson and why it is so relevant today, we need to understand how California agriculture came to be. Before California became a state, before gold was discovered, the Great Central Valley was home to huge lakes and wetlands. You can see it on this map of the virgin watersheds.
If you look back at 1850, there were an estimated 4 million acres of permanent and seasonal wetlands, of seasonally flooded riparian forests, running the length and breadth of the valley. The Central Valley would be, in wet years, an inland sea. The Central Valley hosts 60% of all the migratory waterfowl of the Pacific Flyway during the winter, and a remarkable 1/5 of all the migratory waterfowl in all of North America. So the Central Valley is of incredible importance to these migratory birds. These areas would just provide a haven for waterfowl and other migratory birds, as well as a variety of other wildlife, making the valley essentially impassable. Before, in the era before railroads and paved roads, given the flooding, pretty much the only way to get around the valley in the winter would be by boat. So it was a very, very different landscape, filled with wildlife.
But as the huge influx of people descended on the Golden State, the Central Valley's lakes and wetlands were drained. Reclaimed is the word used. Reclaimed for the purpose of agriculture.
Historians refer sometimes to the agricultural mystique of the West. The idea that irrigated agriculture is essentially always the optimal land use, regardless of what ecological constraints might be present. And of course, it wasn't until well into the 20th century that that mystique began to be questioned. Perhaps if the irrigation of certain types of land is going to lead to consequences that may be toxic, perhaps these particular lands should not be irrigated.
The lakes and the wetlands began to disappear. In an effort to undo some of the damage caused by wetland drainage, the federal government constructed a man-made wetland, a series of large, shallow ponds. The ponds needed a source of water, and there were huge volumes of agricultural wastewater available with no place to go. Sending it to Kesterson became a solution that seemed to make sense. Unfortunately, what was not accounted for was the geologic nature of much of the west side of the valley. There are extremely high levels of a naturally occurring toxin called selenium in the soil.
The selenium in particular, which has caused the most problems, it comes from the rocks of the Coast Ranges to the west, from volcanic eruptions when the Coast Ranges were first being formed millions of years ago. And of course, as rock erodes, it breaks down and becomes soil, and that selenium has moved down from the Coast Ranges into the soils of especially the west side of the San Joaquin Valley.
Over time, the birds, feeding on things that birds like to eat, became repositories of extremely high levels of selenium and other toxic elements that are in much of the Central Valley's soil. A situation compounded by the ag wastewater with its own collection of upstream selenium, pesticides, and fertilizers. Over time, it became clear that the Kesterson Wildlife Refuge, intended as a way to give back to nature, was actually a killing field. It took nearly 5 years for the full understanding about Kesterson to become known, and it took a media spotlight on the problem by Fresno Bee reporters, and later an eye-opening report by CBS's 60 Minutes, to move the government to close it and clean up the Kesterson mess. Which brings us back to dirt.
Spading takes strong muscles. The earth is spaded deep and the soil is turned over. The soil is loosened thoroughly so that the tender roots can grow through it easily.
California farmers are in trouble.
Agriculture interests, particularly on the west side of the valley, like telling us how important they are. But there are hundreds of thousands of acres that have the exact same problem that caused the deformed birds, and they have other significant soil issues.
You've got several 100,000 acres of land on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley that has drainage problems because there are clay layers, subterranean clay layers, and they block the downward percolation of irrigation water. They back up to the root zone, and this water becomes progressively saltier. The shallow groundwater, which will ultimately kill the roots, the crops. And so to keep the land in production on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, you need to bury pumps in the ground and pump the shallow groundwater out and into canals and drop your water table below the root zone so you can continue to grow crops. Now, they've been working on this problem since the 1950s. Where do you put all the salty wastewater that's generated by industrial agriculture?
It doesn't mean because it's a desert that we cannot go and bring water in here and start growing things. All we have to do is deliver water, and then we can grow anything we want.
The governor is partially right. Add water and crops will grow. But at what cost? Massive amounts of fresh water have to be dumped on this toxic desert soil. Crops that are subsidized, with subsidized water, on toxic land that leaches poisons back into the aquifer and the aqueduct system. This is madness. Bad farms on bad lands, irrigated with bad water, is a tragedy that needs to be stopped. And although it is a complex problem, a simple solution to making what is wrong right again does exist.
Irrigation of those lands is not only consuming water from the system and is part of the water that is exported from the delta, it's also creating water quality problems and in fact other toxic problems. Our position has been that the cheapest and most efficient solution is to retire that land and not irrigate it.
The retirement of the 1.3 million acres of drainage impaired poisoned land in the Central Valley, which would free up 4 million acre feet of water.
The State Water Board is not protecting the delta. In order to protect a few hundred growers on the west side of the valley, we're clearly exceeding the ability of the delta by pumping these huge volumes of water. My solution is that you declare the irrigation of high selenium soils an unreasonable use of water under California law.
And what about that bond measure? Well, there are plenty of laws on the books about water that are ignored. If the state simply enforced the laws, the delta would improve. The bad farms on bad lands using bad water would be forced to shut down. We don't need an $11 billion bond. Just enforce the laws on the books. Say no to the water bond in November. Share this video with your family, friends, and coworkers. Don't let the water pirates continue to dominate the discussion. Salmon water. Now.